Welcome to the Tie-Dyed Therapist. I'm your host, Richard Killian. And in today's episode, I have a very special guest joining me today. His name is Peter Grayson. He is the founder of the Flow Initiative, right? And you're also a licensed chemical dependency professional.
Yep.
Right? And in today's episode, we're really going to be covering this whole brand new topic of ketamine assisted therapy. Something I've been very interested in knowing more about over the years, and I know that you've been quite skilled at this over the last few years. So I want to hear all about it, and I want to hear about a little bit about your background and how you really began.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on, and thanks for doing this. I think it's really important to have more platforms and spaces for these conversations. And to really learn more about this. Interestingly, it's not so new. And I think what is very new and needed is back to more of this, more platforms to really educate and understand, especially in the clinical realm, what is going on, how is it going on, what are best practices, where's the evidence, where's the research, where's the history, back to how some of this stuff has been practiced now for many decades even. And so that being said, also more than just ketamine, ketamine assisted therapy, CAP, as it is typically put into an acronym, is the only legal lane right now, especially in New York. There's legislation on the books now to open that up into psilocybin, maybe even MDMA. Other states, Oregon has really been a pioneer from really developing an infrastructure to support therapeutic applications of psilocybin-assisted therapy. Coming into MDMA is just passing phase 3. I think it just did pass phase 3 clinical trials, coming into the final stages of the FDA approval. So now we're probably looking at anticipated spring, fall, summer next year that it will be.
What would you say is the main appeal for people that are considering that kind of therapy?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And that kind of also brings back to the need of more of this, because the main appeal versus what really works or how they are so effective might sometimes be two different things. And that's why we need more of this, to also help recalibrate expectations and what somebody might be drawn to, so that we're also staying within the realistic and evidence-based kind of lanes, and reconciling appeal and desire with what's possible, practical, and appropriate.
Okay.
So primarily what I think is so exciting and game-changing, and back to, I guess the heart of your question, what's really the appeal of, and I'm going to generalize if it's okay.
Of course.
Psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Sure.
And the analogy I like to use the most is it's kind of like bringing in electricity to tools. So now we've got power tools.
That's right.
So now we've got power tools. And it's in that context that it's so exciting, because it's kind of now game changing in that we've got abilities that we've never had before. It's not saying all of a sudden we've got cures. There's this new panacea, silver bullet, new tech that we've got that's going to solve everything. And that goes back to, a little bit of a problematic, kind of theme and cultural movement that's going on. So some people are drawn to a little bit too much, this is going to just save me, change everything, solve everything, cure everything, and a lot of hype that kind of supports that. But simply put, as a power tool for the mind, what it can facilitate, from what I've found, from what I've seen, anecdotally seen, in the data itself, is unlike anything else that we've been able to really apply in terms of how it can help us achieve a desired objective and outcome.
Right. So I guess what I'm assuming, Peter, is that people maybe come to you saying, I've tried all these other things. I've had minimal success with some of it. I need the power tool, to use your analogy. And so is it that they sort of see it as like a last hope, or do they see it as just a new improved version of recovery, for instance? I mean, I know you use this a lot for chemical dependency issues, right?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all I was going to say. I mean, it just sounds like I'm wondering like what kind of mindset people have when they come in the door, really.
Other good questions. In these questions, it's also reflective of the movement that we're going through. We hear it being called a renaissance, and within that renaissance, one of, I think, the pillars of this renaissance is who's asking, who's coming in. Years ago, primarily, it was more referral based from other practitioners, typically psychiatrists, other therapists, who it was kind of last resort. Really dealing with the most acute, treatment resistant, challenging, threatening cases, typically, in that sphere, suicidality, treatment resistant depression, inability to engage, real crisis scenarios. And so, just like you said, last resort, the typical kind of course from that point is kind of long game, wow, this is, a really serious situation, a very tragically sick, suffering human being, most likely might need to, at this stage, given what's going on, threat to themselves, others, very vocal about this, most likely going to need to be committed, maybe looking at ECT, other very invasive, intensive protocols, so again, back to long game. What really ushered in so much of the initial research and practice with psychedelic medication was just in this sphere of how you can essentially have a reversal in those acute presentations of suicidality, and where you're just meeting that resistance that's preventing the engagement, and just maybe like with a lever, like a power tool, open something, enable something to happen. With that window, with that space, that's where, the therapeutic, aspects and everything else comes in. But it's simply the tooling of opening up that allows so much to happen. So back to the question, it used to be primarily practitioner referrals, with, kind of a last resort, type of approach. Now, there's like the pollen effect that's commonly, colloquially being discussed, from the Michael Pollan Netflix show. Back to the real cultural movement, renaissance going on, Google teaching us more than anything else. So the average person doing their own research, and what we've got, by just doing a quick search and all of that, gives us so much info. So we now have a lot of individuals who the spectrum is now wide from, hey, I want to just optimize my wellness. And I hear so much about, this new movement of, and kind of like modern medicine is all about early interventions, prevention, stay ahead of it. Physical fitness is a foundation of modern medicine more than anything else. So it's kind of like maintaining mental fitness and optimization is one angle that a lot of individuals, and now a lot of infrastructure in the space is supporting, from almost like, I don't want to say DIY, like do it yourself type of organizations that can help. Hey, you can have an evaluation online with a doc and get mail ordered a bunch of ketamine lozenges, or you can go a very clinical route, or you can go an experiential route and a ceremonial route. There's a very, very wide spectrum. And so the general public is really entering into the conversations and the curiosity and the investigation. So
something that I'm always, I don't fully understand, and maybe you can elaborate this for me, is, I know that ketamine and psilocybin are both hallucinogens, correct?
Yes. Keep going with the question, and then
but can you tell me the difference? Because I think people probably either confuse the terms or they use them, interchangeably. And I know that, there's certain treatment protocols, there's certain things going on in the work that you do. And that includes the type of medication, the dosage, all of it, right? So can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. That's where the question went. Because taking a step back from that, let me just define the term psychedelic. It was coined, back in the late, this is not the exact etymology of it,
Yeah.
A contemporary of, the Hoffman Leary sect, when things kind of branched out of just the clinical scientific research realm into the kind of cultural, recreational, countercultural movement. And it was kind of at that juncture that the term got coined, which also encompassed a pretty wide umbrella of substances, from what would be considered a hallucinogenic to things that might produce or facilitate hallucinations. But the mode of operation and the mechanisms with which they operate within the brain are very different.
I see.
Some ways, the term and the classification of psychedelic for medication can kind of be like a little bit of a red herring misnomer. And I really wonder and question if in a few years we're going to have a whole different term, much different classification. Because back to what your real point was, is there is a pretty wide variation and the effects between what are, and we've even got within psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, the synthetics, and even sub-branches. But within the psychedelic category, you've got a pretty wide range of systems with which they operate within, effects, and basically every other metric of anything you would gauge in psychopharmacology. So it's interesting. There's also kind of, and I'm going to really try not to go off on a tangent, but I already did a little bit. Backing up, another really interesting thing, though, that does keep psychedelics somewhat separate from a lot of the other medications. I love the cats, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah.
Is and go back to one of the game-changing, really exciting aspects about it. And this isn't a commentary on psychopharmacology or, the modern treatment ecosystem and the DSM, which now there's more chatter and controversy coming out. However, we can kind of say or generalize, I don't want to be a reductionist, saying, for the most part, the majority of psychotropic meds are designed to mitigate the symptoms. And a lot of psychotherapy is also designed to mitigate the effects of the symptoms of what is out of order, maladaptive, what we're suffering from, and kind of adopt a healthy lifestyle out of that.
Yes.
Psychedelics, for the most part, what's so exciting about them is the ability to now go to the root of the disorder and back to the power tooling, what that enables us to do to kind of get inside, to really go in deeper to the brain, to allow the brain to function deeper, so by going after the root versus just going after the symptoms, you're also kind of really trying to achieve something much different. With that being said, the reason I'm bringing that up is you have things, another whole huge topic within psychedelic therapy, assisted therapy, any kind of psychedelic application to wellness is microdosing and all conversations related to microdosing. I just want to bring that up and park it because and this isn't any commentary on microdosing. A lot of evidence is still out, to be determined. And coupled with that, for the most part, what microdosing is, and very effectively doing so in many instances, and there is research that shows this, is mitigating symptoms. It's not within the greater model that I'm focusing on in terms of like the real psychedelic mechanisms, experiences, and what that does with the hardware, software of the brain in terms of psychedelic assisted therapy. So that being said, like things like microdosing are separate. So when we get into, and that has a wider range of substances also that are being utilized.
Yes.
But yeah, back to like ketamine, for example, is a dissociative anesthetic. It's in that dissociative state that, yes, you can promote and are likely to have hallucinations or such extreme disassociations. You could have like an ego dissolution. But that's a different type of hallucination than it might be happening with psilocybin, operating on different receptors also. Psilocybin operating on the serotonin receptors where ketamine is primarily on GABA, different mechanisms within the brain. So the hallucinations are a byproduct. And what's really going on in the software and in the hardware is more the disassociation or the shutting down. And a common framework that's now being used and talked about more and more is the understanding of like the default mode networks and the networking of the systems within the brain. And I'm not a neurologist. I'm nowhere near a neurologist. So also take as I'm explaining this with a grain of salt. There are those who can do so far more eloquently and accurately than I can.
Yes. So if I understand this right, then Peter, it sounds like what people typically focus on when they go into this kind of therapy is the hallucination or the psychedelic aspect of it. But what you're telling me is that ketamine impacts certain receptors in the brain that really allow for a externalization of whatever problems people are going into. So in other words, I guess what I'm picking up, and you correct me if I need to be, is that they're able to step out of themselves enough to start looking at problem areas in a way that they may not have been able to had they not been taking that medication. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's accurate. It provides space. That's one way. And just backing up for 1 sec also, I'd love to reframe the word hallucination also. What I would almost reframe it into is the experience. And then the adjective to apply to that would be mystical. So a mystical experience. It's kind of nuanced, but it's a little different than a hallucination, which is a little more specified to, something that's either visual, auditory, very sensory specific.
Yeah. Right. Opposed to mystical, which might be more of a learning experience.
Exactly. It's more of, and it can be sensory, it can be based on a hallucination, but it's more, the associations with the hallucination might be the act, but it's the association to the act or the event that's happening. So it's a mystical experience. So to what you were getting at, it's kind of with that detachment, with that disassociation from what would have been and what are our coded default mechanisms that we develop over time that really operate on a subconscious level, but back to the systems of the brain, they're networked and really operational. And so what these medications do is shut down that default networking, that default, like we hear terms like defense mechanism. So what if that defense mechanism shut down? What if you are able to, and this would be something you would hear somebody say, anecdotally, very commonly, like, I'm so aware I'm now talking about and processing stuff that I've never been able to even comprehend. And it's really difficult. It's painful. It's hard. It's sad. But I'm doing it. And I'm aware that I'm doing it. And And just being aware that I'm doing it in and of itself is so life-changing, because now that gives me some hope, understanding, and whatever. And now then to be able to process through, that's really going to be foundationally changing, because now, things are that's what we're looking to achieve traditionally, conventionally, with most interventions, is kind of like a reprocessing, a reconsolidating, spatial, relational alignments, being shifted. One of the best.
So I know that you use ketamine in terms of substance abuse issues, right? But it's also used for trauma. It's also used for major depressive disorder. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Are there other things that ketamine is used for besides those three things?
Yes, many. And so tremendous amount of also research data. Ketamine actually has FDA approval, or it's actually a analog S-ketamine. And it's a brand name Spravato. I think it was in 2018, maybe 2019, FDA granted approval. And that was for treatment-resistant depression. And so PTSD now has a tremendous amount of evidence basis for the applications. A whole litany of different use disorders, a whole litany of other maladaptive disorders, to different axes, now disorders are really being looked at. There are some, and again, I don't want to be misquoted and inaccurate, but was just reading something about a study looking at, it was either paranoid schizophrenia or also bipolar disorder, things that typically were, in essence, contraindications for psychedelic medicine, are even now in some ways being studied and researched in terms of the efficacy for treatments. So yeah, the umbrella is very wide in terms of where the body of evidence lies.
That's great.
It is. It's really exciting. My background, my specialty is addiction treatment. Great body of evidence for that. The UK has really been leading the charge. Awaken Life Sciences has now put ketamine for alcohol use disorder. They're now entering phase 3 clinical trials. I want to say it was like an 86% reduction rates or outcomes, reduction of relapse rates at 6 months out. 86%. That's almost like inverted from what traditional outcomes are.
So in your professional opinion, what makes for a good candidate for this medication? Like a good candidate would have what going for them when they come into this?
First and foremost, would not have any of the contraindications.
Right. Okay.
Depending on the medications can vary a little bit. Ketamine is a very safe medicine overall. It's on the short list of World Health Organization's essential meds. It's a battlefield anesthetic because you can't OD somebody on it. It doesn't have a CNS response.
I see.
So, and also the side effect profile is kind of narrow. And psilocybin has slightly wider. Some of the others, MDMA, DMT, even wider still side effect profile, especially getting into cardiac issues, but also issues with other medications that might be contraindicated. Again, because psilocybin works on serotonin receptors, still a lot of going into, SSRIs, what impact does that have? Ketamine, fairly not on the serotonin receptors primarily, so that is not such an issue. So minus any of the top level, contraindication, an optimal candidate, since I already listed, first and foremost, second is informed. And has a realistic expectation, isn't looking or hasn't been led to believe or seek a quick fix. Like, here's going to be a magic bullet that's going to solve everything. And I don't say that lightly. I say that because when you are, as you accurately pointed out earlier, dealing with a segment of population that this really is last resort. If going in with unrealistic expectations and there's any disappointment, that's a really vulnerable position to be in.
Right.
So you really want to make sure, somebody's coming informed with realistic expectations. As we, kind of screen through that or understand that, then and you touched on it earlier, who's had some experience with treatment resistance, or even sometimes treatment resistance is framed in the sense that the problem's with the individual, not with the treatment system or the protocols that we're using or the methodology. Not everything is for everyone.
Yes, right.
Our modern treatment system and methodology it's also, frankly, a very homogenous, not really multicultural, inclusive system. So I also don't want to only say, those who have experienced treatment resistance or who haven't had success elsewhere, but who might just feel like they are unable to find success and feel like,
So you mentioned, earlier on that people microdose, and they do lozenges, and they do different things on their own, right? And you made the distinction about those kinds of activities as opposed to somebody who is in treatment, who is getting therapy, who's taking the medication alongside of getting some therapeutic guidance. So I guess where I want to go with this is I want to hear more about what a client can expect if they're working with somebody trained in ketamine assisted therapy. Because I would think, just my own take on it is it's exciting, but it would probably scare the bejeebus out of me, right? If I'm taking it for the first time and I don't know really what to expect. And how does a therapist kind of help somebody through that process?
Right. That's very much related to the kind of the expectations, and here are two key words you hear used: set and setting. The expectations and the set and setting with which somebody's coming in. Set really refers to the mindset that they had. Inherent in that mindset is a willingness, a willingness and acceptance that, all right, this is going to be a process. It's going to require active engagement, dare I say work. So understanding that is key, so with regards to that, there is a process, it's not just, okay, we're going to schedule, a treatment now tomorrow. You really do want to work along in that process, from preparation to really setting intentions and planning.
Right.
And screening and evaluating and learning
and building trust.
Exactly. Right? So there really is so much to that process around it. And even backing up a step back, I talk about research, data, and the clinical lane. All of the research, for the most part, all that, I don't want to sound judgmental, that meets that rigorous scrutiny, to get the mainstream publications that move the needles. It's all unanimously showing that the therapeutic, the integrative dynamic is the most critical variable, almost more so than the medication itself.
Right.
And so back to, somebody coming in, inherently having that understanding that, it's not just the medicine. The medicine is a tool, tool to be used in the context of some greater framework. Understanding that, then you kind of have to map it out. There's going to be a fairly intensive screening and evaluation process to then rule out any of those contraindications we talked about earlier, to get background information. How do you assess? How do you evaluate what really is going on if you don't take the time to do that? And then, like you also pointed out, the rapport, the therapeutic relationship is important. It's key. And that also goes into set and setting. Setting also being the setting in which we're undergoing these experiences, which has a huge role and impact in that. So all of that, and through that process, and you can really even measure it, and there are measures and scales that could be utilized through this process to really gauge, levels of fear, levels of all of that, and really mitigate and shepherd somebody through that process well.
Yes. So on the average, and I know that every client is different in terms of their treatment. On the average, how many sessions would you say somebody goes through ketamine treatment?
I'd say on average, by the statistics, by the models that are out there prevailing wise, 6 to 8 tends to be the sweet spot magic number most used.
Okay.
In terms of establishing packages and protocols.
Right.
I keep saying this, backing up again, taking a step back, because they're such complex, nuanced,
of course,
issues and topics, and that's part of the beauty, but also part of the complexity, and challenges in some ways. Sorry, I just got distracted for a second. I should not have had my phone on my side here. Give me the question.
So 6 to 8 sessions is a sweet spot, right?
Yeah, I mean, the step back that I wanted to take that I just got thrown off kilter is back to the differences between the molecules, the medicines, the compounds, and so forth and looking at how not only the mode of operation, how they work, what mechanisms and all of that, but also sustainability, the hardware versus software, what's going on from the standpoint of neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, real changes within the hardware of the brain. Ketamine, for the most part, I'm kind of summarizing a lot of metadata here. Ketamine, for the most part, tends to be slightly shorter acting, so is evidence by a lot of that, than, let's say, psilocybin and even MDMA in many applications. Seminal research studies for psilocybin was just like a single dose psilocybin study. So ketamine has been shown to require slightly more protocoling. So evidence shows, and might also either require or someone might stand to benefit from some refreshers, kind of some rebooting.
I see.
Not the same intervention, but maybe just to pop a level back up.
I see.
All of that being said, the individual rules all, and back to where that process is so important to really give that individualized attention to assess and evaluate, well, what really is going on? What are the needs? Right. And then even within that, in a real collaborative process, and back to your point of building that rapport and trust, because that collaborative process is also so key to then, through the integration post-experience, evaluate, where are we? And don't want to always front load things and kind of set it and forget it model. That's a little too old school, where we want to respond and collaborate to the individual, well, where are you now? So I don't like to kind of say ahead of time more often than not, unless there are, which in some cases there are, like backing up, like for certain use disorders, that ketamine for the arrest of alcohol relapse study in the UK. That is done with a set amount of, it's actually 3 infusions with about 7 therapy integration preparation just around it. So that is, a package protocol model needs to be to go through the clinical trials. But overall, for the most part, as a general rule, the individual is going to be the primary determinant, and B, ketamine might require slightly more frequency than some of the other classic, or maybe not even classic, like MDMA.
Understood. Right. So, what I really like about this model that you're describing is the idea that the client really has full control over how far they want to go in the process. Sometimes when people get prescribed things, particularly SSRIs, it's a bit, it's a bit vague as to how long they're going to be on these medications. And even if they try them and they're getting some results from them, a lot of people are not really keen about taking them for long, extended periods of time, right? And then there becomes this dialogue with the treatment provider about whether they should get on or whether they should get off. The treatment provider is very influential at that point, right? I mean, they can say anything.
Yeah.
And what I like about this process that you're describing, it just sounds like the person has a lot more control, right? They can try this out. They can work with somebody in a facilitated way. They can get to places that they may not have been able to get to before. And then, like you say, they can do a tune-up later on if they feel they need to, right?
That's exactly it. And, it's almost ironic when you think of a lot of traditional and even some of the more modernized psychotherapeutic based on this concept of like person-centric, but how central is the individual, is the client in that collaborative process, in that treatment planning process, and even engagement process? Not really. They are the subject, but not in that they're an active participant and collaborator. And I subscribe to that philosophy. I didn't make it up by any means. That is critical. And I think it does so many things on so many different levels. From one most human, empathetic side, it helps alleviate some of that fear, some of that apprehension. Two, it just pragmatically is going to offer more potential for more efficient, effective outcome.
Yes.
Because, we don't have the same kind of diagnostic test to get into somebody's mind. So we're relying on what they're reporting. The more rapport there is to facilitate that reporting, the better it's going to be. The more collaborative, the more out of that kind of traditional provider, providee relationship, the better.
Well, that's part of the reason why I wanted to speak to you, was that, you've been doing therapy for many, many years. You have a good, solid clinical background. I've been doing therapy for over 20 years. And as you know, as a practitioner, when the client walks in the door, you want their full collaboration with you. You want their participation. And yet, they're coming in with various issues going on that may hinder that participation, right? So I'm always looking for new tools. I'm always looking for new ways to engage people and to have people fully participate in their treatment. That's why I was interested in this particular treatment. That's why I was interested in talking to you more about it, because I think that we're in such a fortunate place these days where people can get fully educated on the stuff that they're going to be doing, right? They're not just submitted to doing something.
Yeah, and I think with that, optimally, there's a step further that we can go. And with that education, you can then be empowered to even advocate and develop a level of agency for yourself that you are a collaborator in your own care. You know, and another kind of inherent premise of dare I say, psychedelic philosophy in general. I mean, it might even be a greater spiritual philosophy, is that, you know, to a certain degree, we are our own best healers. We do have a certain innate healing ability and knowledge of ourselves that, even if that might not be the case, or we can argue, are we or aren't we? I don't think we can argue that, well, there's a pretty darn good resource in that. Why wouldn't we want to capitalize on that, you know?
Right.
But it's fascinating how frequently we don't, you know? And look, I don't make a secret of the fact I came into this as a patient myself. You know, this entirely is a second chapter. And that's what then made me go back to school, you know, want to become a clinician and do this work. But I think it's also with that eye of, you know, having experienced some of this, that it makes it impossible to segregate the heart from the head, you know. So inherently, it's, you know, what's on your mind, but what's on your heart, you know, and how do we help address both and listen to both and understand that one is gonna have an impact on the other, and will always be an active factor. So we can't always be in just one single, you know, model or methodology or even realm. For many years, I would consider myself a recovering clinician, or not even a therapist, because I didn't want to put a box around what it is that I did, because sometimes there's almost a level of humility with it. Like, it's not up to me to say this is what that person needs, and I'm going to fit that round peg into this square hole and make it fit. So are there other things that we could then integrate in and take more of like a multidisciplinary integrative approach? That fascinates me, because at the end of the day, you know, it's human beings and ecosystems.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And I really appreciate that humility, because, you know, even though, you know, we go through school, we go through all these courses, we go through all this clinical training, sit with hundreds and hundreds of people, we don't always know what somebody needs, you know? Even though we might have seen flavors of it or little aspects of it, and we're reminded, oh yeah, I remember I had this patient years ago, they acted like that, or they used to say things like that, right? This is what worked for them. We can't make the assumption it works for the other person.
Absolutely.
Right?
Or even more dangerous, this is what I did for myself. This is what worked for me, you know.
Yes.
That to you. Another real vulnerability for us that got to be aware of. So it is.
Right. So I was just going to say, Peter, you know, the next time we meet, I would like to explore more of this treatment with more studies. You know, like you have such a, you know, a whole vocabulary of this. You know, you know all the studies about it, some of the efficacy of it. You know, what works, what doesn't. You know, I really wanted today to just really kind of provide a primer for people to understand, like, you know, expectations, myths, understanding that, you know, this is but one treatment of many, right? People are getting some relief. Some people are getting some real progress out of this treatment. And I wanted to speak to somebody who really has understood both sides of the equation. So if you'd be willing to come back and do something more research oriented, that'd be great.
I'd love to, and I kind of agree with that. I think there's something great about just presenting the info, kind of cutting the chat, the misinformation, and just giving that top level, objective dump.
Right.
Now we can look under the hood. And that really then goes to where there's such excitement, because those numbers are so damn exciting, and
Yes.
yeah, that would be exciting to do, to then look under the hood and see. And that's where those terms like game changing, groundbreaking, they're not hubristic. And that's what's so exciting, especially for me as a person. And I don't mean to sound hubristic in this, like, this is a very personal, passionate mission of mine, because I'm, it's kind of like that old commercial for the hair loss guy. Like, I'm not only, but I'm the president,
Yeah, right.
I'm not only a provider, I'm a forever patient in some ways. So, I think it's so important we have more of this. It's so important that there are more platforms and resources out there. So I'd love to.
I agree. And so, for people that are watching the Tie-Dye channel, if you have any questions or comments or anything that you would like us to tackle on this particular subject, please feel free to leave comments below. So with that said, thank you again, Peter, for joining me. I appreciate the time and the effort, and I'm learning all the time, as are you.
As am I, exactly.
All right.
Thank you for the opportunity, and take care. Good night, Kitty.